Good afternoon. I'm John Hart, the co-founder of the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, or C3 Solutions, and I'm the editor of our news magazine, which is called C3. This week, we're recognizing Nuclear Science Week, and we're honored to have a very special guest, Kerry Emmanuel from MIT. Kerry is one of the most respected and influential climate scientists in the world. He's a professor of meteorology, and he was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in 2006. Kerry, welcome. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, Kerry, I wanted to spend most of the time talking about a really fantastic piece I'd recommend to everybody called Nuclear Salvation that was published in a publication called The Bridge. But I want to ask you something. In your climate science primer, you have a very interesting statement where you described science as, quote, a deeply conservative enterprise. Could you elaborate on that and tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, science has a tradition going back hundreds of years of being conservative in that sense. And what I mean by that is that a lot of what we do is formulate and test hypotheses. And the formulation part, people can be put anything on the table, but the testing part is very conservative in the sense that we set a very, very high bar for detecting something or validating a theory. It really has to go through a lot of tests, and everything is always up for grabs. I mean, even the general theory of relativity, people keep testing it, even though it's never really failed a test. Science is evolving, but yeah, we're conservative, and usually we are guilty of lowballing risks. Places in the past where we've been asked to assess risks, and that is a scientific endeavor to some extent. We tend to err on the low side. I mean, a good example was the earthquake and tsunami in Japan a few years ago. The earthquake that did all that devastation was a magnitude 9, and geophysicists had estimated the maximum possible earthquake you get on that fault was an 8.3, which is a lot less when you consider what that scale is all about. So we're conservative in that, in risk assessment.
And when you talk about risk assessment, it's important, I think, for people to think about that term, because as we've talked about, as you've talked about publicly, is there's a lot of overheated hyperbolic rhetoric in the climate debate. Does that frustrate you? Do you find it troubling when people use terms like alarmism, denial? What are the terms that we should be using, and how should we be thinking?
Well, I come back to the word risk, because the rational approach to risk, if viewers think about how they deal with their own risks in their own lives. For example, when they go out to buy insurance, property insurance or car insurance or something, you're making a rational calculation. What's the probability you're going to wreck your car? And how much are you willing to pay to avoid that, or not to avoid it, but to pay for it when it happens? Okay, obviously you want to avoid it. The same thing for your house. What's the probability it might burn down? How much are you willing to do that? So there's a rational process of assessing what's at risk, how much it costs, how much you're willing to pay to avoid that or to mitigate that risk. And that's, I think, how you have to look at the risks that are involved in climate change. There are a set of risks. You're right that they get, on one side of the political spectrum, they're hyped up to being much more than they probably are. And on the other side, they're hyped down. That's just, unfortunately, these days, normal politics. But we who are just interested in getting down to making rational decisions have to go about estimating what are the potential costs of climate change. And given those costs, what measures make financial and other sense to implement to try to mitigate that risk?
Right, and a term that you've used in previous lectures is tail risk. And so I'll try to explain it, but you fill in because you'll explain it better than I will. But the idea of a tail risk is if you look at a risk distribution table, in other words, the UN may have an estimate of what the range of temperatures could be on the high or low end. But the reason to be very concerned is that there is, on the farther end of that scale, there's a risk of something really bad happening. Now, that's a very profound question. What is really bad? What would happen to the climate? And I would add, what would happen to human civilization? Whereas if there begins to be serious rapid climate change, what will the human responses be? Civilization has proven to be fairly fragile supply chains. We're seeing that right now. So that issue of the tail risk, I think you've identified before, is really important. And so let's talk about how to reduce the tail risk, because I think you've done a good job of describing the situation as not apocalypse never, to quote a book, but apocalypse maybe. Whereas some people may say probably not, but maybe. There's a whole range of I think, responses there. Is that a fair characterization of tail risk?
It is. And I mean, the professional way that we look at it is, first of all, we have to start out confessing, and there's nobody in climate sciences who wouldn't confess that there's still a lot of uncertainty. Even if we could nail down exactly how much the global mean temperature would change, and that's probably not going to happen, but hypothetically, supposing we did, we still have a lot of uncertainty about what the consequences of that really are, because the consequences are mostly felt through extreme events like droughts, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and so forth. And we're just starting to get a handle on that. But, professionals define risk as the product of probability and cost. So let's consider a risk that we might very well encounter or can easily imagine, supposing that we're late taking our daughter to meet her school bus, and we get there just as the bus is pulling in, but it's across the street. So you have to make a decision: let the daughter run across the street to catch the bus, or take her to school yourself at the risk of being late for work. It's sort of an everyday kind of risk. Now, supposing you estimate the probability that if she ran, there's a 98% probability she'd make it, okay? And that if you just thought of that probability, you'd say, yeah, let her run. But I don't think anybody listening to this would make that decision. I certainly wouldn't. If there's a 2% chance she'd be killed, now I'll take her to school and be late for work. That's an example of tail risk, right? It's a low probability event, but it's so bad that we do a lot, maybe even at an extreme level, lay down our lives to do that. So when you do this professionally for complex risks, you do that. You take every little risk, consider the probability of it, multiply the risk by the cost by the probability, and then sum that over all the different kinds of risks. And that's been done by professional economists. Really nice paper in 2017 by Solomon Xiang et al. In Science did this. There are other things, and there are big error bars on this risk. But that's the way you look at it. And then you say, all right, well, how much am I willing to pay to mitigate that? Now, I have to say that when it comes to climate change, I always sort of invert that, because if you have a country that's very innovative, like the United States, and it comes up with an attractive carbon-free alternative to fossil fuels that would be attractive for a developing country like India to buy as opposed to coal, we make a lot of money on that transition. And we wind up with an electricity and an energy system that's cleaner, better. We're killing 8.7 million people around the globe every year from particulates from fossil fuel combustion, and nothing to do with climate. It's a byproduct of it. It would be nice if we get rid of that. So I think there's a real opportunity. It's not just about risk, it's also about opportunity. There's a really opportunity to make the world a better place. But it requires technical innovation and a lot of creativity to do that. But I think that the United States is still a very promising place for that to happen.
So we've established that the conversation should be about risk, tail risk, reducing that risk, and opportunity. So let's focus on the opportunity and also how that's going to reduce the risk. So in your piece called Nuclear Salvation, you write, I'm a climate scientist highly motivated to find the best and fastest route to decarbonizing energy. There's a lot of consensus on that. You say two things are crystal clear. To avoid the worst risks of climate change, the global economy must be thoroughly decarbonized over the next few decades, and progress is nowhere near fast enough. And then you walk through why nuclear fission technology is a viable option. And you have a very important observation where you estimate that the cost of doing that is about $500 billion gross per year through 2040. But as you just alluded to, if you reduce the costs associated with the deaths associated with particulate matter, burning less clean forms of energy, you save about 400 billion. So you're dealing with a net cost investment of $100 billion, which is 0.1% of gross world product. So it sounds like what you're describing is if we were to, quote, go nuclear, meaning replace dirtier burning technologies with nuclear fission, we could do that at a cost of about 100 billion net per year through 2040. Is that accurate?
That's the calculation, and it's very important to understand that it's not just the existing electricity that's being decarbonized, but we're also imagining a world in which most of transportation, ground transportation anyway, is also electrified, which greatly increases the electricity demand. So we set a very high goal for electricity production in 2050, much higher electricity production than today, also accounting for the fact that we hope that countries like India will have big per capita wealth increases, and which also means more energy consumption. So we're building a pretty liberal estimate of how much energy we're going to need in 2050. And it's pretty clear that to get there, right, because we have empirical examples from the past, you do it with a judicious combination of nuclear energy and renewables. They really need each other. You really can't push renewables much more than 40% of any mega grid before you have to start storing energy. And right now it's way too expensive to do that. And nuclear has the enormous advantage of running 24/7 and can provide baseload. So we have the examples of Switzerland, Belgium, France, and Sweden, who in response not to climate change, but to the first oil shock, decarbonize their electricity in 10 years using, in all cases, combinations of nuclear and hydropower. It's been done, all right? The problem now, I think, for the United States is we've made nuclear power too expensive. We haven't given it the subsidies that solar and wind have, and it's very hard to compete with fracked gas on price.
Right. So as you know very well, so when policymakers talk about climate change, they tend to hector the other side to, quote, listen to the science. So do you feel like as a climate scientist, you're being listened to on this topic of nuclear?
No, I don't. I feel very lonely, John, because there are a lot of people on the right, and I spend a lot of time talking to Republicans. I used to be one myself. I'm an independent now, but that's hardly matters. And, they're beginning to understand that we have a problem. And they're beginning to understand that we have an opportunity. Global energy is a $7 trillion market. That's pretty big. And China and Russia are capturing it right now. We shouldn't let that happen without giving them a run for their money. On the left, I'm frustrated because they've taken off the table the most promising tool to address that, which is nuclear power, because they have developed a bunch of myths about it being dangerous. So
talk about those. Focus on those myths for just a minute, because it's useful for people.
I mean, there are actual dangers of nuclear power. The most important one to talk about, I think, is nuclear proliferation. But the waste and the safety issue, let's talk about safety. There's really been only one nuclear accident that killed a lot of people, and that was Chernobyl, the old Soviet Union. It didn't have a containment structure. It was a bad design. We'll never build another one like that. And, the World Health Organization says it killed 44,000. Greenpeace says it killed 60,000. Okay, let's be generous and take the Greenpeace effort. More people die of particulates from fossil fuels every 3 days, than have died in the whole history of nuclear power. And yet the environmentalists have made sure that we're burning fossil fuels and not nuclear by taking nuclear plants offline. I'm sorry to say that, but they're a big obstacle to progress. And we need people if it's necessary, on the other side of the political spectrum to say, this is not how you do it. So yeah, I'm a little lonely.
well, we're happy to provide some hopefully thoughtful company collaboration. Yeah. So does it frustrate you as a conservative? We find it frankly maddening where we're told to listen to the science, but but there's an effort to link a lot of policies that have nothing to do with climate change to a climate conversation, like universal preschool, Medicare for all. Do any of those have a carbon reduction benefit that you're aware of as a climate
No,
scientist?
I don't. And you're making a valid point that this is this is what frustrates people like me, is that there's a whole set of people who don't think it's a problem. There's another set of people who see it as a valuable tool to advance agendas that may have nothing to do with climate. So neither side, in some sense, is serious about it. And I'd say that's true everywhere. It's not just a problem in the US.
Mhm.
And that's why nothing really has happened. Very, very little has actually happened. I mean, with all the fuss and things of renewables, they're still contributing in this country, in most parts of the world, a relatively tiny percentage of the power, electrical power we generate. Germany is up to 40%, but they rely heavily on surrounding countries to supply power when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. And so if you really include the whole grid that's being used, it's nowhere near 40%. Also, Germany has very high electricity prices. They've set a good example, I think, about how not to go about doing this. And it's an example people ought to study. So yeah, there's a lack of seriousness. To be generous to the human race, I can't think of a time in history when we have successfully dealt with a problem that is principally going to fall not just on our children, not on our children even so much as our grandchildren. And we're just not programmed as a species to think on those timescales. But I hope we can figure out how to do it. I think the key is to understand the demand for carbon-free energy is growing demonstrably in much of the world. We have an opportunity, a market opportunity to supply that. For that reason alone, even if you don't care about climate change, why shouldn't we grab it?
Yeah, and I want to ask about risk, but also the cost in just a minute. So in terms of the risk, how much of an impact would your proposal have on the tail risk? In other words, if you could give a rough estimate, even just as a descriptive, not as a hard number, what would it do for risk? How much of an impact on risk would embracing a clean technology like nuclear fission have around the world?
Well, the further out in the tail, the bigger the proportional impact. Let me explain. It's actually pretty simple math. So, a lot of people say, well, we're going to get it from being 3 degrees to get it to 2 degrees. Okay. What does that mean? Well, even to me, it means almost nothing. Who cares about a degree of temperature change? When you go out in the tails, for precisely the reason we talked about when we talked about risk, you get huge, when you put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you get huge increases in risk. The really high-end hurricanes, the really high-end floods, they go up very, very fast. And that's why it's expensive. The flip side, to be optimistic, is that when you back off on the carbon, you get those huge reductions in the tail risk. I don't want to put numbers on it because you'd have to really do the math, but proportionally speaking, you get much more bang for the buck in the tail when you reduce risk than you do in the center of the distribution. So it really does buy us a lot of aversion of catastrophic risk when we figure out how to, to decarbonize and back down from those more extreme scenarios.
So let's talk about cost and just mechanics of how to do this, perhaps. So when you talk about $100 billion, just to give the listeners a context for our budget, so the FY22 budget is about $5 trillion. So 500 billion, which is the gross cost, 10%. Mm-hmm. And if you use your estimate of the net cost of 100 billion, you're dealing with about 2% of the budget. That's not insignificant, and that's solely if the United States took all this burden upon itself. So that obviously would never happen in the real world, but how could this actually be implemented? Do you see, if you could be in charge of the COP meeting coming up that will be out in Scotland, how would you put together a coalition of the willing or the capable or the motivated to turn an idea like this into reality?
Well, I think that's a better question to ask economists than me, but I have asked that of economists, and they all say pretty much the same thing. We need 2 things to happen. First of all, we need to tax externalities. That's a bedrock free market principle right out of Milton Friedman. You can't start a business in your home, dump the waste in your neighbor's yard and make your neighbor pay for it. That's not right, okay? You have to absorb the costs of dealing with the waste. We're not doing that now. Carbon dioxide is a dangerous waste product. We've identified it. It's not dangerous to breathe in small quantities. It's dangerous for the climate. So it makes sense to tax the externalities, just the health externalities of coal, right? Forget about climate. The number of people it kills every year from particulates. If you taxed the coal industry is passing it on to the health industry. If you taxed, if you made the coal industry pay for health externalities, they go out of business, okay? Which they should, because it's too expensive when you consider the cost to human health. So you implement a carbon tax, but that isn't enough. I think the United States has, in particular, and other Western countries should do much more to stimulate innovation. And that includes in the nuclear field, especially. There's all kinds of great new technology that's not far from being marketable, like small modular reactors and other kinds of nuclear designs whose waste is a lot less serious than that of the light water reactors that we're now running. So there's some combination of innovation and taxing externalities, and that's worked for us in the past. It worked very well in the case of averting what would today be a really bad situation when we passed the Montreal protocols and started to tax these chlorofluorocarbons. Not nearly as big a deal as CO2, but it worked, right? We averted a big catastrophe that way. It didn't cost the economy. We may end up making money on it, really. So it's not magic. It's not rocket science. That's what we need to do.
Well, I think as an organization, we've talked about the carbon tax issue before, and this is where we're proud to be classical liberals in the sense that we invite views that don't necessarily always line up with our own organization. So we're not for a carbon tax, but we understand the need to set priorities. And I think one of the levers that's not even being discussed or considered is why not reprioritize and rethink existing funds within government budgets in the United States and elsewhere. I spent years working for U.S. Senator Tom Coburn, legendary fiscal conservative.
Mm-hmm.
He documented hundreds of billions of dollars in waste. So if we took an issue of duplication in the federal budget or Medicare fraud, if we did better and wasted less money, we could reprioritize existing resources within the budget. And we're not this is not an anti-government argument. It's a smart priorities argument where there are many examples in history where we funded basic research or basic technology. The Marshall Plan, is another example where there was government subsidy that had a long-range free market benefit. So there's not a fundamentalist kind of response here. And so we're very active and interested in this debate. And we just think there's different ways there's an open conversation of how it's best financed without hurting the fundamental driver of innovation, which is the big thing.
Well, of course, you could do I can't remember what the official word for it is, a neutral carbon tax. Is you take the money and redistribute it back to the people, just write them checks. So it wouldn't really be a tax, but it would be a redistribution. I think this is an interesting discussion, and I would hope that conservatives would be serious about externalities, because that's just wrong, right? When you let one industry pass the cost of doing business onto a different industry, that should be against the law. But we can talk about that later. I think the innovation side of that is probably more important. Right? If we can stimulate innovation, we can actually make money off the transition to carbon-free energy. And I think if we did that, we would be making much more rapid progress toward decarbonizing. And by the way, the carbon tax could also be negative. If I go out in my backyard and I take carbon out of the atmosphere and bury it, I'm speaking a little bit figuratively there, I ought to get that money back from the government. So I think there are ways of structuring it that also encourage people to invent ways of economically taking carbon out of the atmosphere. If you could do that, there's not much downside to burning natural gas.
Well, and let's talk about one other technology in the nuclear space, which is fusion. So some people will argue Kerry, this may be a great idea, but what if we spent even 0.1% of gross world product on a technology, deploying that technology, and then 10 years from now, we come up with a better technology, or 20?
Yeah.
How do you respond to and your obviously institution is leading the way on diffusion?
I think that there's a fairly straightforward response, John. That is, we simply, from a scientific standpoint, cannot wait anymore. And the reason is that the lifetime of carbon in the atmosphere is order of a few thousand years, right? So it's not like you can wait and then just reverse things. It's if we stopped emitting carbon today, the carbon content would level off pretty quickly, but it wouldn't start to go down. The climate itself would warm up for a little while longer. That's sort of built into it, and then finally level off, but we're not going to go back down. The longer we wait, the longer we're going to be stuck with the warming. So we can't wait for the innovation, but we can do something sensible, like begin to deploy things like combinations of renewables and nuclear power. You design grids of those combinations, they're golden. France did it. France didn't suffer any economic harm from doing it, I might add. And they've got a very stable, very nice, enviable electricity system. We know how to do it, right? We should start doing that. And we should put a lot more funding into fusion. There's this great fusion effort going on at MIT. I'm not impartial to that, of course, but it's the first time in a long time I felt optimistic we're going to get there, but it's not going to be overnight. It's going to be order 10 years. So it's not either or. We do what we can do now that makes market sense, it makes common sense, and it makes climate sense, and work on better alternatives at the same time. That's always been the way this country has improved technology.
Well, I know you're following the reconciliation argument closely, the infrastructure in Congress and the paralysis we're seeing right now. Do you have any optimism or any hope or any strategy, any thoughts you want to share about how to persuade policymakers to give nuclear a much more serious look? And maybe what are the incremental steps they can take short of this large scale kind of global Marshall Plan of getting countries to build fission reactors?
If I were a dictator, John, I would start buying nuclear power plants from South Korea. South Korea exports them. They manufacture very good ones. They're US designs, right, for a third of the cost it takes us to do it. So what happened in the United States is we have a very, very clumsy nuclear regulatory apparatus. Everybody knows it. Congress is actually trying to reform it. It's not like nothing's being done, but it's happening too slowly. And we've lost many, many, many years of innovation from that. Nuclear, I know this is going to be shocking. Nuclear is too safe, right? It's too safe in the sense that, you know, if we have airplanes are very safe compared to cars, for example. They could be safer. Supposing you could make them twice as safe at the expense of twice the ticket price. What would happen? A lot of people would say, I'm not going to do that. I'll get in my car and drive. And guess what? The fatalities would go way up because you're driving people away from a safe thing. And this is nuclear in spades, right? When we decided not to develop nuclear after 3 Mile Island, which didn't kill anyone, by the way, the worst accident in the United States, no deaths, nobody estimates any deaths from that. When we failed to develop nuclear, we drove people to fossil fuels whose particulates kill a lot of people every year. It was a dumb decision, all right? We've made nuclear too safe. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission demands that plants be built to withstand a 1 in 10 million year event. That's crazy. We don't have any idea how to estimate a 1 in 10 million year event. It's been made too safe and therefore way too expensive and driven us to depend upon much more dangerous sources of energy. I think the United States, including Republicans, have a really great opportunity now to reverse this, but they got to get moving on it, okay? And I think it's a great market opportunity. If we can do this, the export market is really big, so we can be doing good and making money, if you will, at the same time.
So it sounds like the best way to make something unsafe is for government to make it, quote, safe.
Yeah, they've effectively driven people to a much less safe technology. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very, very fascinating point. Well, Kerry, anything else that you'd like to say about your piece that I haven't asked about or emphasized?
Not really. I've actually just sent in proofs to a follow-on piece that was commissioned by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists about that it's going to be part of I guess there's a pro-nuclear piece from me and an anti-nuclear piece from someone else. I haven't seen the anti-nuclear piece, but that goes into some more detail about than I did in Nuclear Salvation about the actual safety issues and risks of nuclear power. So, yeah, I'll send you a link when that comes out.
Good. We'll look forward to reading that. Well, Kerry, thank you so much for your time. And just for all of our viewers and listeners, I've been with Kerry Emmanuel. He's an atmospheric scientist at MIT. Encourage you to Google him. He has his own website. Has some really tremendous materials on climate science. It's worth your time to go on YouTube and watch his lectures and speeches. And again, I'm John Hart, the co-founder of C3 Solutions. You can watch this video and see our content and future coverage of Kerry's writings as well, and our news magazine as well. So thank you so much, and look forward to visiting again.